They blocked the old man at a general's funeral. Then the four-star general stopped everything for him. "Sir, you cannot enter without proper credentials." The MP's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "I don't care what you think you did 40 years ago. If this story moves you, please like and subscribe for more incredible tales of honor and sacrifice." The urn slipped from trembling hands, brass catching sunlight as it tumbled toward the marble steps of Arlington National Cemetery. Time fractured into crystalline moments, the gasp from the honor guard, the collective intake of breath from 200 mourners, the metallic ring as General Marcus Connor's remains scattered across stone that had witnessed 1,000 farewells. Franklin Hayes dropped to his knees, arthritic fingers scrambling to gather what remained of his friend. The same hands that had dragged Connors from a burning helicopter in the Mekong Delta now shook uncontrollably, age and emotion, making them betray him at the moment that mattered most. Blood seeped from his palms where broken brass had cut deep, mixing with tears that came without permission. "Get him out of here," someone shouted. Military boots surrounded him, a forest of polished leather and pressed uniforms. Hayes couldn't look up, couldn't face the disgrace of what he'd done. 43 years he'd carried the weight of that day in Vietnam, 43 years of survivor's guilt and midnight terrors, and now he'd failed Marcus one final time. The crowd pressed closer, whispers building into a crescendo of judgment. He could feel their stares burning into his stooped shoulders, could hear the rustle of dress blues, and the soft sobbing of the widow he'd never met but had dreamed about in letters Marcus never sent. His Purple Heart, the only decoration he'd kept pressed against his chest like an accusation. "Please," Hayes whispered to the marble, his voice lost in the chaos. "Please, I just wanted to bring him home." 3 days earlier, Franklin Hayes had been just another invisible veteran in the sprawling anonymity of Detroit's East Side. His duplex sat wedged between a check-cashing store and a boarded-up pharmacy, the kind of neighborhood where gunshots mixed with sirens in a nightly symphony that no longer kept him awake. At 72, Hayes had learned to navigate the world quietly, drawing his disability check shopping at the same corner market where Mrs. Chen knew his order by heart, and spending his evenings watching old war movies with the sound turned low. The newspaper clipping had arrived without explanation, tucked inside his mailbox between utility bills and grocery store circulars. The obituary was brief, clinical in its military precision. General Marcus Robert Connors, age 73, died peacefully at Walter Reed Medical Center after a brief illness, survived by his wife Patricia and daughter Sarah. Funeral services to be held at Arlington National Cemetery. Hayes had stared at the grainy photograph, an older Marcus in dress uniform, chest heavy with ribbons and stars, until his eyes blurred. The boy he'd known in Vietnam had grown into everything Hayes had never become. While Marcus climbed the ranks, Hayes had returned home to a country that preferred to forget taking jobs that paid cash and asked no questions, watching his marriage crumble under the weight of nightmares he couldn't explain. The VA hospital knew him by name, though not fondly. Hayes was the veteran who asked too many questions, who remembered when promises were made and noticed when they were broken. His case file was thick with complaints about delayed benefits, missed appointments, and medications that worked until the budget ran dry. Dr. Morrison, his psychiatrist, had been trying for 15 years to get Hayes to talk about Vietnam. Hayes preferred to let sleeping demons lie. His apartment was a study in careful minimalism, not by choice, but by necessity. The furniture was second-hand, purchased from estate sales and thrift stores. The walls were bare except for a single-frame photograph, Alpha Company 1st Cavalry Division taken 3 days before the battle, that would define the rest of his life. 23 faces smiled back at him, young men who believed they were invincible. Only 7 had made it home, and of those Hayes was the only one still breathing. The decision to attend the funeral hadn't been rational. Hayes owned one suit purchased for his mother's funeral 8 years ago, and unworn since. His car was a 1998 Honda Civic with 200,000 miles and a tendency to overheat in traffic. The drive from Detroit to Washington would cost money. He didn't have to attend a ceremony where he wasn't welcome for a man who probably didn't remember his name. But Marcus had saved his life first, back when they were both 22, and the stupid enough to believe in glory. The phone call came at 2:47 a.m., jarring Hayes from dreams of helicopter rotors and monsoon rain. He'd learned long ago that nothing good happened at that hour. Either someone was dead dying, or about to make you wish you were. Franklin Hayes. The voice was unfamiliar, professionally warm in the way that suggested bad news delivered with practiced sympathy. Who's asking? Hayes kept his voice steady, though his heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird. This is Patricia Connors, Marcus's wife. The words hit him like incoming artillery. I'm sorry to call so late, but I found your number in Marcus's things. He talked about you sometimes, about Vietnam. Hayes closed his eyes, seeing Marcus as he'd been at 22, cocky, fearless, the kind of officer who led from the front and never asked his men to do anything he wouldn't do himself. I heard about the funeral. I'm sorry for your loss. That's why I'm calling. Patricia's voice wavered grief, making her words fragile. Marcus left specific instructions. He wanted you to have something, but you have to come to Arlington. He was very clear about that. The silence stretched between them, filled with 43 years of unspoken words and unfinished conversations. Hayes had imagined this moment countless times, what he would say to Marcus if they ever met again, how he would explain the choices he'd made, the life he'd wasted. He'd never imagined having the conversation with Marcus's widow. Mrs. Connors, I appreciate the thought, but I don't think that's such a good idea. I'm not exactly military funeral material these days. He saved your life. It wasn't a question. Yes, ma'am, he did. Then you saved his. That's what he told me. Said you pulled him out of a burning helicopter when everyone else ran. Patricia's voice grew stronger, more insistent. He carried guilt about that day his whole career. Said he never got to thank you properly. Hayes felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the phantom pain that had nothing to do with his heart condition and everything to do with memories that refused to fade. I was just doing my job. So was he, but he never forgot. The thing he wants you to have. It meant everything to him. Please, Franklin, let me honor his wishes. After hanging up, Hayes sat in his kitchen until dawn, staring at the obituary clipping. The rational part of his mind cataloged all the reasons why attending the funeral was a mistake. He had no dress uniform, no formal credentials, no way to prove he belonged among the generals and politicians who would gather to honor Marcus's memory. He was a ghost from a war most people preferred to forget, a reminder of America's complicated relationship with its veterans. But Marcus had remembered him. After 4 decades of silence, after climbing to the pinnacle of military success, Marcus Connors had thought about the scared kid who dragged him from a burning Huey in the middle of a firefight. That had to count for something. Hayes pulled out his checkbook and calculated the cost of failure. Gas, food, a cheap motel room, it would wipe out his savings and leave him eating ramen for the rest of the month. But some debts couldn't be measured in dollars and some promises transcended the grave. The drive to Washington took Hayes through the heartland of America, past small towns where yellow ribbon magnets on SUVs proclaimed support for troops while homeless veterans slept under highway overpasses. His Honda wheezed through Ohio, coughed through Pennsylvania, and limped into the Capitol with steam rising from the radiator like incense from a funeral pyre. Arlington National Cemetery sprawled before him like a marble city of the dead white headstones, marching in perfect formation across rolling hills. Hayes had been here once before for the dedication of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, but that had been different, a crowd of survivors seeking closure, not the formal pageantry of a general's funeral. The security checkpoint was his first obstacle. Military police in crisp uniforms examined credentials with the thoroughness of customs agents, their eyes scanning invitation lists and security clearances. Hayes approached with the careful humility of a man accustomed to being turned away. Name and credentials, sir. The young MP's voice was polite but firm, the kind of professional courtesy that could turn cold in an instant. Franklin Hayes, I'm here for General Connors' funeral. Hayes handed over his driver's license and VA identification card documents that marked him as a veteran, but not necessarily one worthy of admission to such an exclusive gathering. The MP's scanner beeped negative. No invitation, no security clearance, no place on the carefully curated guest list. I'm sorry, sir. Your name isn't on the approved list. This is a private ceremony for family and invited guests only. I served with the general in Vietnam. His widow asked me to come. Hayes kept his voice steady, though he could feel sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cool morning air. Sir, I understand, but without proper authorization, I cannot allow you entry. Perhaps you could contact the family directly and arrange. There's no time for that. Hayes pulled out the newspaper clipping, now worn soft from handling. The service starts in 20 minutes. Mrs. Connors specifically asked me to be here. The MP studied the obituary with the skepticism of someone trained to spot forgeries and con artists. Behind Hayes, a line of black sedans approached their occupants, undoubtedly possessing the proper credentials and social standing that he lacked. He was holding up the funeral of a four-star general with his pathetic attempt to crash a ceremony where he didn't belong. "Step aside, please, sir. I need to process these other guests." Hayes moved to the side, watching as senators and generals passed through security with the ease of the entitled. Their uniforms were perfect, their medals gleaming, their presence unquestioned. He caught fragments of conversation discussions of military budgets and strategic initiatives, the kind of high-level concerns that had never touched his world of disability checks and VA appointments. Colonel Sarah Martinez emerged from one of the sedans, her bearing marking her as someone accustomed to command. Hayes recognized the look, the same confidence Marcus had carried, the certainty that came from being trusted with other people's lives. She noticed him standing awkwardly by the security booth, his cheap suit and nervous energy marking him as an outsider. "Is there a problem here?" she asked the MP, her tone suggesting that problems at her father's funeral would not be tolerated. "This gentleman claims to be invited, ma'am, but his name isn't on the list." Martinez studied Hayes with eyes that missed nothing, the faded Purple Heart pin on his lapel, the careful way he held himself, despite obvious pain, the newspaper clipping clutched in weathered hands. "What's your name, sir?" "Franklin Hayes, ma'am. I served with your father in Vietnam. Your mother asked me to come." Something shifted in Martinez's expression, recognition dawning like sunrise after a long night. "You're the one who pulled him from the helicopter." "Yes, ma'am." She turned to the MP with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "He's on the list now." The funeral service unfolded with military precision, each element choreographed to honor a life of service and sacrifice. Hayes sat in the back row, acutely aware of his second-hand suit among the sea of dress uniforms and expensive civilian attire. The chaplain's words washed over him like white noise, familiar phrases about duty and honor that felt both sacred and hollow. Then Patricia Connors approached the podium. She was smaller than Hayes had imagined, elegant in her grief, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled mourners. Marcus often said that a man's true measure isn't found in his victories, but in how he treats those who can do nothing for him in return. Her eyes found Hayes in the crowd, holding his gaze with surprising intensity. He never forgot the young soldier who risked everything to save him in Vietnam. That act of courage shaped the man he became and the leader he grew to be. Hayes felt the weight of 200 stares as heads turned to locate the subject of her words. His face burned with embarrassment and something deeper, a recognition he'd spent 4 decades avoiding. The scared kid who'd dragged Marcus from that burning helicopter hadn't been thinking about courage or heroism. He'd simply been trying to get his friend home alive. After the service, as the crowd dispersed toward the reception, Patricia approached him with a small wooden box. Her hands shook as she offered it to him, and Hayes could see Marcus in the set of her jaw, the determined way she held herself upright despite her grief. "He wanted you to have this," she said simply. Inside the box, nestled in faded velvet, lay Marcus's Purple Heart, not a replica or a spare, but the actual medal he'd received for wounds sustained in that same helicopter crash. Beneath it was a letter sealed but addressed in Marcus's careful handwriting, "To the bravest man I ever knew." Hayes stared at the medal, his vision blurring as the implications crashed over him like a mortar blast. Marcus hadn't just remembered him, he'd honored him, carrying the memory of that day through 4 decades of military service, through promotions and commands, and the gradual ascent to the highest levels of military leadership. "I can't take this," Hayes whispered, his voice barely audible above the distant sound of traffic on the Memorial Parkway. "You already have," Patricia replied. "You took it the day you saved his life. Marcus just wanted to make it official." The letter, when Hayes finally found the courage to open it that evening in his motel room, was brief but devastating in its honesty. "Frank, by the time you read this, I'll be gone, and I hope you'll forgive an old soldier's presumption in reaching out after so many years of silence. I've thought about that day in the Mekong Delta every day of my career, not because of what I lost, but because of what you gave me. You gave me 43 years. I wouldn't have had a wife. I wouldn't have met a daughter I wouldn't have raised. You gave me a life worth living, and I spent that life trying to be worthy of your sacrifice. The Purple Heart was always yours. I just kept it safe until I could return it properly. Thank you for bringing me home. Marcus Hayes sat on the edge of the motel bed, holding the medal and feeling the weight of a lifetime's misunderstanding. He'd spent 43 years believing he was the one who owed a debt, the survivor who'd somehow cheated death while better men died. Marcus had seen it differently, not as survivor's guilt, but as a gift freely given and gratefully received. The revelation changed everything. Hayes wasn't a broken veteran seeking forgiveness. He was a hero who'd never been properly thanked. The drive back to Detroit should have been triumphant, but Hayes found himself pulling over every few miles, overwhelmed by emotions he couldn't name. The Purple Heart sat on the passenger seat like a talisman, catching sunlight through the windshield and throwing rainbow fragments across the dashboard. For the first time in decades, Hayes allowed himself to remember Vietnam not as a source of shame, but as the place where he'd done something that mattered. But returning home brought its own challenges. The neighborhood looked shabbier, somehow the boarded windows and broken streetlights more depressing after the marble grandeur of Arlington. His duplex felt smaller, more cramped, the silence more oppressive. Hayes found himself staring at the Purple Heart for hours, trying to reconcile Marcus's words with the life he'd built on a foundation of unworthiness. The first phone call came 3 days after his return. Dr. Morrison from the VA hospital, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a professional who learned not to get too invested in his patients' breakthroughs. Franklin, I heard about your trip to Washington. How are you processing the experience? Hayes considered lying, offering the kind of non-committal response that had gotten him through 15 years of therapy sessions. Instead, he found himself talking, really talking, for the first time since his return from Vietnam. About the helicopter crash, about dragging Marcus through the jungle, about the 43 years of nightmares and guilt that had shaped every decision he'd made since. He called me brave, Hayes said finally, his voice breaking on the word. I never felt brave. I felt terrified every single day over there. Courage isn't the absence of fear, Franklin. It's acting despite the fear. You saved a man's life. That matters regardless of how scared you were. The second call came from Sarah Martinez, Marcus's daughter. Her voice was professional but warm, carrying an urgency that made Hayes sit up straighter in his kitchen chair. Mr. Hayes, I've been thinking about what happened at the funeral, about what my father wrote in that letter. I have a proposition for you. She explained that she'd been working on a project, a documentary about unsung heroes of the Vietnam War stories that had been overlooked in the larger narrative of a controversial conflict. Marcus had mentioned Hayes in several interviews, describing the helicopter rescue in detail and lamenting his inability to reconnect with the man who'd saved his life. I'd like to interview you if you're willing. Your story deserves to be told. Hayes felt the familiar urge to decline to retreat into the anonymity that had protected him for so long. But Marcus's letter had changed something fundamental in how he saw himself and his place in the world. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. The interview took place in Hayes's living room, Sarah's camera crew working around the sparse furniture and bare walls with professional efficiency. She asked gentle questions, drawing out memories Hayes had buried for decades. He talked about the helicopter crash, about the chaos and confusion of combat, about the split-second decision that had defined both their lives. What do you want people to understand about that day? Sarah asked her camera, capturing every nuance of his weathered face. Hayes thought about the question about all the ways he could answer it. I want them to understand that heroes aren't special people. They're ordinary people who do what needs to be done when it needs to be done. Your father was the real hero. He spent 43 years making sure that one moment of courage meant something. The documentary, when it aired 6 months later, changed everything. Hayes watched himself on television with a mixture of pride and embarrassment, seeing his story woven into the larger tapestry of American military history. The phone calls started immediately, other veterans sharing their own stories, historians seeking interviews, reporters wanting to explore the human cost of war. But the most important call came from Patricia Connors. Franklin, there's something else Marcus wanted you to know. Something I couldn't tell you at the funeral because the lawyers were still working out the details. Marcus had left Hayes more than a medal and a letter. In his will, carefully drafted and legally binding, he'd established a foundation in Hayes's name, the Franklin Hayes Veterans Support Center, funded by Marcus's military pension and life insurance policy. The center would provide counseling, job training, and housing assistance to veterans struggling with the transition back to civilian life. He wanted you to run it, Patricia explained during their phone call. Said you understood what veterans needed because you'd lived it yourself. Hayes stared at the legal documents spread across his kitchen table, overwhelmed by the magnitude of Marcus's final gift. The foundation had an initial endowment of $2 million, enough to lease a building, hire staff, and provide services to hundreds of veterans. It was more money than Hayes had ever imagined, more responsibility than he'd ever wanted. I don't know how to run a foundation, he protested. I never finished college. I've been living on disability checks for 20 years. Marcus thought you were the only person who could do it right, Patricia replied. He said the military teaches people how to be soldiers, but nobody teaches them how to stop being soldiers. You figured that out the hard way. The weight of the opportunity was crushing. Hayes had spent decades feeling like a failure, a broken veteran who'd never lived up to his potential. Now he was being asked to help other veterans avoid the same fate, to turn his hard-won understanding of trauma and recovery into something that could save lives. The first hurdle was bureaucratic. Establishing the foundation required lawyers, accountants, and endless paperwork. Hayes found himself navigating a world of tax codes and nonprofit regulations, struggling to understand concepts that had never been part of his working-class vocabulary. The lawyers were patient but expensive, their hourly rates eating into the foundation's endowment with alarming speed. The second hurdle was personal. Running the foundation would mean giving up his anonymity, stepping into a public role that would invite scrutiny and judgment. Hayes had spent 43 years hiding from his past. Now he was being asked to make it the foundation of his future. The third hurdle was practical. Where would the center be located? Who would staff it? What services would it provide? Hayes had ideas born from personal experience. The need for housing assistance, job training, mental health support. But translating those ideas into a functioning organization seemed impossible. The breakthrough came during a meeting with Dr. Morrison at the VA hospital. Hayes had gone to discuss his own treatment, but found himself describing the foundation and his fears about taking on such a massive responsibility. Franklin, you've been helping veterans informally for years, Dr. Morrison pointed out. Remember Tommy Rodriguez? You helped him get his disability claim approved. And Sarah Chen, you drove her to job interviews when her car broke down. You've been running a one-man support network out of your living room? It was true. Hayes had always been the veteran other veterans called when they needed help navigating the VA bureaucracy or finding resources. He'd never thought of it as particularly significant, just neighbors helping neighbors. But maybe that was exactly what Marcus had seen, not a broken veteran, but a natural leader who'd been operating without recognition or resources. The decision to accept the responsibility came gradually, then all at once. Hayes found himself saying yes to meetings, yes to interviews, yes to the terrifying prospect of building something meaningful from the ashes of his own struggles. The foundation would be different from other veteran organizations, less focused on patriotic rhetoric and more focused on practical support, less interested in honoring service and more interested in helping veterans build lives worth living. But first he had to face his biggest fear, speaking publicly about his experiences, owning his story in a way that would make him vulnerable to judgment and criticism. The press conference was scheduled for Veterans Day, a symbolic date that would mark the official launch of the Franklin Hayes Veterans Support Center. Hayes spent weeks preparing, working with a media consultant who helped him craft talking points and practice answering difficult questions. The night before the event, he sat in his kitchen staring at Marcus's Purple Heart and wondering if he had the courage to step into the spotlight. The phone rang at midnight. It was Tommy Rodriguez, the veteran Hayes had helped navigate his disability claim. Hey Frank, I heard about tomorrow. Just wanted to say thanks, man, for everything. You saved my life, you know that. Hayes didn't know how to respond. He'd never thought of his help as life-saving, just basic human decency. Tommy, I just made a few phone calls. Nah, man, you did more than that. You showed me I wasn't alone. That somebody gave a damn whether I made it or not. That's everything, Frank. That's everything. After hanging up, Hayes understood what Marcus had seen in him, what Patricia had trusted him to build. The foundation wasn't about money or buildings or programs. It was about connection, about making sure no veteran faced their struggles alone. He was ready. The press conference was held in the community center where Hayes had been attending AA meetings for the past 5 years. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same room where he'd struggled with his demons would now witness his emergence as an advocate for others fighting similar battles. 20 reporters showed up along with local politicians, VA officials, and a handful of veterans Hayes had helped over the years. Sarah Martinez was there with her camera crew, documenting the moment for her ongoing project. Patricia Connors sat in the front row, Marcus's Purple Heart pinned to her black dress like a badge of honor. Hayes approached the podium with hands that shook only slightly, his prepared remarks folded neatly in his jacket pocket. But as he looked out at the assembled crowd, he realized he didn't need notes. He had a story to tell, and he'd been preparing to tell it for 43 years. My name is Franklin Hayes, and I'm a Vietnam veteran who spent most of his adult life believing he didn't deserve to come home. His voice carried clearly through the small room, steady despite the magnitude of the moment. I'm here today because another Vietnam veteran general, Marcus Connors, spent his life proving me wrong. He told the story simply without embellishment or false heroics. The helicopter crash, the rescue, the 43 years of silence that followed. He talked about survivors' guilt and PTSD, about the challenges of transitioning from military to civilian life without adequate support. He described his own struggles with employment relationships and the VA system that was supposed to help, but often felt more like an obstacle course designed to discourage claims. General Connors left me more than money. Hayes continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. He left me a mission. The Franklin Hayes Veteran Support Center will be different from other organizations because it will be run by veterans for veterans with the understanding that coming home from war is just the beginning of the battle. A reporter raised her hand. Mr. Hayes, what makes you qualified to run a multi-million-dollar foundation? You have no formal experience in nonprofit management. Why, no, it was the question Hayes had been dreading, the one that touched on all his insecurities about education and social status. But as he looked out at the faces in the crowd, veterans who trusted him with their problems, civilians who'd come to hear his story, he found his answer. You're right. I don't have an MBA or a background in corporate management. What I have is 20 years of experience being failed by the system and 20 years of figuring out how to navigate it anyway. I've helped dozens of veterans get the benefits they earned, find jobs, secure housing, and access mental health care. I did it without resources, without funding, without recognition. Now I have the chance to do it right. The questions continued for another hour, covering everything from the foundation's budget to its planned services. Hayes answered each one honestly, admitting when he didn't know something, but explaining how he planned to find out. By the end of the session, even the skeptical reporters seemed convinced that he was the right person for the job. 1 year later, Hayes stood before a different crowd at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Franklin Hayes Veteran Support Center. The building was modest, a converted office complex in a working-class neighborhood, but it was theirs. The first floor housed counseling offices and meeting rooms. The second floor contained job training facilities and computer labs, and the third floor provided temporary housing for homeless veterans. In the 12 months since the press conference, Hayes had learned to be a CEO, a fundraiser, and a public speaker. He'd hired a staff of 12, including 3 other Vietnam veterans, 2 Iraq War veterans, and 1 Afghanistan veteran. Together, they'd helped 347 veterans access services, secured housing for 89 homeless veterans, and placed 156 veterans in permanent employment. The ribbon stretched across the main entrance, red silk against gray concrete. Patricia Connors stood beside Hayes, holding oversized scissors and smiling through tears that had nothing to do with grief. Sarah Martinez was there with her camera, documenting the moment for a follow-up documentary. Dr. Morrison had driven down from the VA hospital, along with Tommy Rodriguez, and dozens of other veterans Hayes had helped over the years. Marcus would be proud, Patricia whispered as they prepared to cut the ribbon. Hayes thought about that, about Marcus in his general's uniform, about the scared kid who'd pulled him from a burning helicopter, about the 43 years of silence that had finally been broken. I think he knew this would happen, Hayes replied. I think he planned it all along. The scissors cut through the ribbon with a satisfying snick, and the crowd erupted in applause. Hayes stepped back to let others enter, first veterans who needed services, volunteers who'd helped to build the center, community members who'd supported the project. He was content to watch from the sidelines the way he'd done for most of his life. But Sarah Martinez wasn't having it. She took his arm and gently but firmly guided him toward the entrance. "This is your moment, Frank. Don't you dare try to hide from it." As Hayes crossed the threshold of the Franklin Hayes Veteran Support Center, he felt something he hadn't experienced since that day in Vietnam, the certainty that he was exactly where he was supposed to be doing, exactly what he was meant to do. Marcus's final gift hadn't been money or recognition. It had been the chance to transform a lifetime of struggle into a foundation for hope. The center's motto, engraved on a plaque by the front door, captured everything Hayes had learned about service and sacrifice. Coming home is just the beginning. No one fights alone. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot where Hayes's old Honda sat next to Patricia's Mercedes and Sarah's news van. It was a good metaphor. Hayes thought: different vehicles, different journeys, but all heading in the same direction, all bringing their passengers home.